Hello everyone, my name is Reese Koszczynski. This is Simple Philosophy, where we simplify philosophers to help you better understand life. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at neoliberalism. In particular, we're going to be taking a look at the role of the individual within neoliberalism, neoliberal economics, and the role of the state within neoliberalism, whilst referring to some key authors and key writers. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Timestamps are available down below in the description. And without further ado, let's get into it. I think the best place to start with neoliberalism is within its definition, because it's somewhat of a problematic term when it comes to applying and using it. To put it in the way of one of my former lecturers did when I was at university, neoliberalism means everything and nothing at the same time. Some people used the term to refer to either the modern economic system that we are all living in, or elements of classical liberal economics that find its way in our modern economic system. It has been used by David Harvey in particular to describe a system which has been designed to transfer democratically funded state assets into the hands of a rich elite. Others have argued that it's a non-concept at all, that it doesn't even form part of liberalism or conservatism. It's not a coherent theory, so therefore it doesn't exist at all. And others have actually used neoliberalism to describe modern liberal economics in terms of intervention and those things we've looked at in previous videos. But neoliberalism as a concept was popularized by Milton Friedman in his essay Neoliberalism and Its Prospect in 1951, where he outlines some of the key things that we are going to discuss in this video. Similarly, neoliberalism has been used as a term to describe the economic model which was implemented during Pinochet's dictatorship of Chile between 1972 and 1990. This was following the election of a socialist government when the army in Chile took over and then installed market reform policies in order to move away from collective ownership. It's also been popularized worldwide by Reaganomics and Thatcherism too. So the ideas of neoliberal economics has influenced that new right shift that we have seen occur in recent years. It's also been an influence on Bill Clinton and Al Gore, as well as Tony Blair and the new Labour government that came in the 1990s. And it's also been an influence on China as well, particularly since the fall of Chairman Mao and the reforms that were initiated by Deng Xiaoping. What has been coined by David Harvey as neoliberalism with Chinese characteristics. So let's have a look at more of the specifics as to what neoliberalism actually is. Now, in relation to the economy, neoliberals tend to hold, or at least a neoliberal theory tends to hold, that they are in favour of laissez-faire capitalism, which is the idea that the economy must be free from government regulation, subsidies, and the taxation for public expenditure. That laissez-faire capitalism is the best way to improve individuality and the individuals in a society. Very, very similar to the classic liberalism video that I have done previously. The slight difference here is that there's more of an emphasis on markets, or the idea that markets should be competitive. The primary virtue or emphasis of laissez-faire capitalism within neoliberal theory is that markets should be competitive at all costs, that they should constantly be competing with each other, because that is the best way to improve the standard of living for everyone, lower the price of commodities, as well as improve the services and the products that are being produced. Because if everyone is competing with each other, you're going to want to be the best. So that's going to drive you to make the best and cheapest product that you can, which is going to benefit the whole of society. So therefore, laissez-faire capitalism and market competition is central. Now, this isn't just limited to the role of the nation state. They believe that not only should the markets within a nation state be competitive and competing with each other, but that the country needs to compete in international markets too, and that these international markets need to be competitive, that we can't have one nation or one country dominating or controlling the international markets, that different countries should be able to compete in order to drive up the standards respectively. This means that there needs to be a removal of trade barriers so that your product can be exchanged and traded across borders with no restrictions or tariffs, and that this will be key to the innovation and wealth creation that we need for society to move forward. So the best way to ensure that markets are competitive, that laissez-faire capitalism moves and is maintained, is to privatize previously owned assets by the government and put them into private hands so that they can then function in a market and be competitive, and then deregulate things like health and safety laws or limits to trading, barriers to trading, so that the market can function and be competitive to its full potential. So that's essentially what the key ideas in relation to the economy. Neoliberals, we've also found, particularly since 2008, have been in favour of the policy of austerity. And this is the idea that we need to reduce government expenditure through public spending cuts and tax increases. So if we're, for example, spending too much in the economy, has been argued in 2008, the best way to get the economy back up and running again is to actually cut public spending by privatising or marketising those services, and then increasing tax revenues to the government to pay off the debts. And by doing that, you're more or less transitioning to a wholly free market system where government intervention is as limited as possible. Another key notion of neoliberalism is the notion of the individual. Now, this has been central to all of the types of liberalism that we have been looking at throughout this video series, but the individual is central to neoliberalism, and neoliberalism has a slightly different take on what the individual means, or what it means to be an individual within neoliberal society. They believe that individual freedom is best advanced by liberating entrepreneurial freedoms, that by allowing people to have private property rights, to be able to take part in the free market and things like free trade, is the best way to ensure your individuality. So therefore, you are an individual, atomistic individual, interacting within in a marketplace where you can make rational decisions. And so therefore, the market should be able to impact every single aspect of your everyday life, whether it's you flicking through your phone for your partners on Tinder, whether it's you flicking through Netflix, Disney Plus, or whatever TV stations you can have available online, or whether it's the choices you make in relation to university places or college places or school places. All of this allows you to function as an atomized individual in a free market. And this links us back to Margaret Thatcher's old mantra: there is no such thing as society. That society doesn't exist. There are only individuals interacting within a free market. And that by doing this, by having you as atomized individuals in a free market and being allowed to create products and create businesses which enter onto that market, you are therefore upholding the most individualistic freedom and liberty that you could possibly hold. Similarly, much like classical liberals, neoliberals believe that markets produce natural, harmonious and self-regulating systems, that we can all self-regulate ourselves. There is no need for too much law and order in relation to the market, because the market is a natural harmony. It links back to the ideas of Adam Smith: the invisible hand of the market guides all. And this relates to the individual too, that essentially they're arguing that when we function in a market, we make rational choices about what we can afford, the things that we purchase, the things that we buy, and so therefore markets are essentially naturally harmonious, and that this will mean that we need limited intervention as a result. So because people are rational in a market scenario, the state does not need to intervene or get too involved in the lives of the individual. And again, this sounds very libertarian, very freeing in this sense. But there is an increased focus in neoliberalism, which is slightly different to classical liberalism, on the role of individual responsibility. So whilst markets produce harmonious relationship, you as an individual are responsible for how successful you are in navigating this market. You are responsible for the role that you play in this market, and you should not rely on anyone else to help you, particularly the state. You are responsible for your own well-being, and that the market is the best place to provide this. If you choose not to fully utilize the market, then that is your fault. And this links to shifts in notions of citizenship that have occurred since the 1980s, where there's been an emphasis away from individual rights, such as modern liberalism's advocacy of individual rights or protection of minority rights, and instead have shifted towards individual duties to society. There will be some provisions given to you to assist you. However, you need to make sure that you fulfill your duties to society in order to get them, as opposed to you just being given these rights to create an even playing field. field. And then finally, the role of the state in neoliberalism is really key. So one of the key notions argued by Thatcher is that the neoliberal state should actually roll back the state. And what she meant by this was that we needed to privatise assets of the state and move them into private hands. Previously in Britain, the government owned the coal board, the water networks, the telecoms networks, and all these various different businesses. And Thatcher believed that we need to roll back this influence of the state and put it back into private hands, into a private market, so that competition could be created and so that standards could be increased. Similarly, there should be limited regulation of the free market. So in order for the market to truly function, in order for the state to be rolled back, the state should have no role, or at least a limited role, in the market's functioning. So this means cutting back what they refer to as the bureaucratic red tape, that things such as limited consumption, the state setting price signals and various exchange rates, that should all be cut back and the market should be left to do what it needs to do. This red tape needs to be removed, and that's the best way that we can ensure freedom of the individual. So by cutting back this red tape, it increases efficiency because you're not having to splash out on health and safety and all of these other things. It also lowers consumer costs because you don't have additional expenses to take into consideration, and it also improves the quality of the products that you are buying overall, because the money can be driven into improvements into the product as opposed to these external issues that form part of the labour process. Whilst there's been a lot of talk about the individual rights, the neoliberal state also emphasises a strict notion of law and order, and this is something that it shares with conservatism more so than it does with liberalism per se, because obviously for classical modern liberals there is a natural harmony which dictates how society is going to function, how society is going to run. Neoliberalism takes more of a conservative notion in its sense of law and order and state intervention, because they believe that contracts are the essential notion of society and that contracts withhold or uphold law and order within a society, and so therefore the role of the state is to legally enforce contracts. So if you're working for an employer and you haven't delivered, then legally you should be bound to deliver. If you've promised to deliver a product or deliver a certain quality of goods, the law needs to intervene in order to legally enforce these contracts. And this is the best way to protect individualism within a market economy. So law and order is essential. They also believe that the regulation of free trade, and what I mean by that is that making sure there are no additional limits placed on free trade, both in the market by monopolies or by outstanding individuals to the economy, is essential. So the law needs to intervene in order to make sure that free trade and free rights are practiced accordingly. And intellectual property rights would be one of the key areas that neoliberalism has sought to protect and regulate in relation to free trade. That whether you've come up with an idea and you've patented it, that then forms a legal contract, and this ensures the regulation of free trade and that someone's entrepreneurial rights aren't being sacrificed as a result of the competition within the market or abuses of competition within the market. That said, there's somewhat of a huge contradiction within the neoliberal state and how the neoliberal state is supposed to function. So whilst the state is in favour of laissez-faire capitalism, it's against intervention or in favour of limited intervention in the economy. There is also an argument to say that the state has a role in creating and sustaining new markets. So I'm going to use Britain as an example because it's the one I'm most familiar with. But if we think about the NHS or the British education system or local councils, the state has a role in fragmenting and marketising aspects of how these organisations run in order to stimulate competition. So if you think about the NHS, the creation of NHS trusts was there to stimulate competition so that they can balance budgets and then compete with other aspects of the NHS as well as other hospitals to deliver the best service. So therefore there is a role of state intervention there in creating these new markets to benefit capital accumulation. So they believe capital can accumulate best in a market format or a kind of regulatory market format. Education has gone through a similar thing in recent years where marketisation has allowed various different subjects to be taught based on the supply of those subjects, as well as being able to take in as many students as they want, as it brings pennies through the door. Another aspect of education which has been successfully marketised in Britain will be the idea of academies, where we can essentially privatise schools and have academies compete with other academies for students. So even though it is state funded, still to a certain extent, it is essentially run as a private enterprise. And it's the same with universities. Even though the government has given student loans out, the universities have to compete for that money. So they want to attract as many students as possible. And this creates a marketized system in which we are all individualized, atomized consumers, which then impacts your relationships with other people, as well as the people you eventually fall in love with. Another notion that David Harvey recognizes in this role of creating and sustaining new markets is the notion of fictitious capital. So Harvey argues that there has been increased investment from the neoliberal state in building asset bubbles, such as asset bubbles that have been created in the housing market, which led to the 2008 financial crisis. So things that aren't actually rooted in any core value, but we can create fictitious value out of it. We would then invest in that, because that's the only way we can get capital to grow and then increase the well-being of all. The final area, which is linked to state intervention as well, even though neoliberals argue that there needs to be a limited state, it's been shown since 2008 in the various crises that capitalism has fallen into in the 21st century, that the neoliberal state is quite welcome to intervene to save businesses that are too big to fail. So all of this talk about free market, guided by the free hand of the market, and all this stuff is somewhat limited and undermined when you have, say, for example, again in Britain, when the government nationalised part of Northern Rock in order to keep the business going. This would be another example of where the state can intervene in order to protect markets and in order to ensure the infrastructure of the markets. And this links to Michel Foucault's critique of neoliberalism when it first started to emerge in the 1970s. He argued that neoliberalism is just another method of state intervention, but it's state intervention for other ends. Again, for David Harvey, he would argue something kind of similar, where he said that the idea is state intervention to restore class power. So this brings questions of neoliberalism's support for the free market and how far it will take the free market. And this is why people like David Harvey have actually recognized modern China as a neoliberal enterprise that encourages the creation of free markets and opening up since the 1980s through to the 1990s to today. However, there's still a significant amount of state intervention. And whilst that looks different to Western versions of neoliberalism, Chinese neoliberalism nonetheless shares a lot of these characteristics within it. So I think the best way to sum this short video up to what neoliberalism is in Naomi Klein's quote here from 2014, that it refers to the privatization of the public sphere, deregulation of the corporate sector, and the lowering of income and corporate taxes paid for with cuts to public spending. Now, this is essentially summarizing neoliberalism in a nutshell, what it adheres to. But I think due to its contradictions, it's one of those words that has been used in the media to refer to the current economic system, which is reigned since the 1970s. But it's also used as a kind of bogeyman to a certain extent, because it means everything and nothing. It both means state intervention for certain reasons and a lack of intervention for others. Nonetheless, it's an extremely key concept for both understanding contemporary politics, sociology, and economics. But what do you think? Do you think that neoliberalism is a non-concept? Do you think that neoliberalism has ended and we have entered into a new neo-protectionist era? Let me know down below in the comments, and I will see you next time.